번의 발표만을 남겨놓고 있습니다. 이분도 영국에서 오셨고요. 그리고 로이터 통신사로도 알려져 있는 로이터의 저널리즘 연구소 소장님으로 계신 분이세요. 라스무스 클라이스 닐슨 소장님 모셔볼 텐데요. 이분은 현재 영국 옥스포드대 정치 커뮤니케이션학 교수로도 계시고요. 그리고 그 이전에는 언론정치 국제저널 인터내셔널 저널 오브 프레스 폴리틱스라고 하는 저널 편집장이기도 하셨습니다. 중점 연구 분야는 뉴스 매체의 변화에 대한 연구이신데요. 이 연구로 2014년에 티에트겐 상이라는 또 저명한 상을 수상하기도 하셨습니다. 오늘 준비해 주신 주제는 넥스트 비즈니스 모델은? 이라는 주제인데요. 네, 진짜 2일차의 마지막 발표를 장식해 주실 라스무스 클라이스 닐슨 소장님 더 큰 박수로 환영해 주시죠. 환영합니다.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. It's quite an honor to be here and perhaps a particular pressure to be the last person to speak, in a sense that when you leave this room to continue the conversation with your colleagues elsewhere, perhaps over drinks after this event, this may be the last thing you remember. So I hope I will leave you feeling empowered about the future of journalism and the industry that sustains it. But I think we have to get through a couple of sort of slightly dark places before we get to that sense of optimism, conditional optimism, cautious optimism, and that orientation towards the future. The mission of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford that I have the honor of serving as director of is to explore the future of journalism worldwide. We do that through three types of programs. We have a journalism fellowship for mid-career journalists from all over the world, including many journalists who've come from Korea, but we have more than 600 alumni from more than 100 countries who spend time with us in Oxford. We work with media leaders, editors, and executives to try to help them think through the challenges and opportunities they face in their organization and think about what their role is in trying to pursue future editorial and business success. And then we do research, because we believe that journalism, like any other institution in society, benefits from the ability to make evidence-based decisions on the basis of independent, evidence-based, relevant work. And in that sense, we try to the best of our modest ability to play a role vis-a-vis journalism akin to the role that journalism seeks to play vis-a-vis society. We don't have the answers. We don't know what's right for each of you, or for each of the organizations that you work in. But we believe that you will make better decisions if you have access to relevant information that doesn't come with an agenda, that isn't trying to sell you anything, but that tries to help you make the decisions you feel are right for you and for your organization. That's the premise of the work that we do. Now, I say that because just as journalism doesn't always bring happy news to society, sometimes there are problems, sometimes there are challenges in addition to things that go well, we don't always bring happy news or optimistic takes to the industry. But just the same way that journalism fundamentally believes that even when the news might be slightly challenging, perhaps even a bit depressing, and feel a bit uncertain, even then, perhaps particularly then, it's important to share that information with the public. The same way we feel it's really, really important that we help the profession and the industry think about where we are and where we might be heading so we can make evidence-based decisions, realistic evidence-based decisions about where we want to go. So that's what I want to start as the sort of the premise for the conversation that we'll be having about the business of news today. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I actually don't care very much about the business of news. And the reason I say that is that I'm not very concerned about the shareholders or owners of media companies and how they're doing. The thing I care about is journalism. I care about the ability of the profession of journalism to independently and professionally help people be informed to make better decisions. So the reason I want to talk about the business of news today is not because I'm concerned about shareholders or owners or where things are going for these companies particularly. The reason I care about it is that these are some of the entities that are the major investors in independent professional journalism. And economic sustainability is often the precondition of editorial independence. It is the engine that drives investment in news production and independent reporting. And in that sense, we need to think about what is the business that underlies journalism as a profession, and where is that business heading, and what is the role of journalists in thinking about how they do their work today and tomorrow as that business changes. So here is the route I'll take you on. It's a story about what the Austrian political economist Joseph Schumpeter almost 100 years ago called creative destruction, where in his almost poetic language, the history of social change, of how we develop as professions and societies, our norms, is one of evolution, often quite incremental. But the history of economic change specifically is, in Schumpeter's views, a history of revolution, a process of what he famously called creative destruction that revolutionized the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. In this sense, this is not a news story, but I think this is a way to think about what's happening to the business of news right now, this revolutionary process, even as our norms and our understandings are often developing in a more evolutionary fashion. What is the story? Well, I think we have to recognize the starting place. The journalism industry is in a very tough place. I think we also need to recognize that it'll get even tougher. On that basis, I think we can identify the reasons why this is so, and on the basis of that recognition, identify reality-based ways of moving forward. So this is what I'll try to do very briefly in my remarks today, and then open up to questions and discussions of where people think this is working for each of you in your organizations, in your profession, Korea, or elsewhere. So, an industry in a tough place. Let's maybe start just with the backdrop here, and I want to really stress that there is no single universally applicable global story that applies to every country or to every organization or to every individual journalist. But I think it is worth trying to identify some global common denominators that might give you at least a possible scenario of what might be happening in a given country like Korea, even if, of course, there'll always be variation, often importantly so, from country to country. What is the sort of the long-term structural backdrop of this creative destruction, this revolutionary process that we are going through in the profession and industry right now? In many high-income democracies, I think we need to recognize, first of all, that it is a story of a very long-term structural decline in the role of printed newspapers. This graph shows you the paid circulation of printed newspapers in the United States relative to population, something many graphs do not adjust for, from the Second World War till today. And in parallel with that, in fact, so parallel that I have run these numbers many, many times to make sure that this actually is so, the share of the overall advertising spent that goes to printed newspapers. And it is a story of non-stop structural decline for more than 50 years. If we did not see this coming, that was on us. This is the story, if you will, of printed newspapers. Long-term structural decline in markets where people have alternatives. I would say that we should expect something roughly comparable to happen to scheduled linear television broadcasting. This is just some examples. Mukul and Zoe foreshadowed some of this, their presentation this morning. This is just some numbers specifically from the United Kingdom of the development in the daily average viewing time of television viewers in the UK from 2010 to 2019. So from 2010 to 2014, amongst all viewers, so age 4 and upwards, there was a 15% decline in daily viewing time. Amongst younger viewers between 16 and 34, those of you who are 34 can rest assured that you are still young, there was a 15% decline, so parallel from a lower base. Younger people watch less TV than older people and children. From 2014 to 2019, the overall decline amongst all viewers continued apace, 16% decline in daily average viewing time. Amongst younger people, 43% decline in 5 years in daily viewing time. The top line, the average amount of television viewing in the UK, is held up by the fact that older people watch more and more TV, even as everybody else is moving their eyes away from the big screen and towards other offers. So I think television is in for a structural disruption on the scale of what has happened to print in recent years. Now, of course, we can already see right now what some of the winners in commercial terms are of this development, some of the companies that benefit very handsomely from the structural change in audience behavior. In a global perspective, Google and Facebook are amongst the central actors. So this is obviously something that's quite different from country to country, but in most countries around the world where there are no political barriers, I realize Korea is a partial exception to this, with strong domestic platform companies, but in most countries around the world, Google and Facebook by now account for more than half of digital advertising, and often account across their many different products and services for something like 40% of the time that people spend with digital media. So it's very clear that we have these very dominant and extremely commercially successful, but also successful with the audience, new competitors that are competing for attention and for advertising, and are putting immense pressure on the old business of news that, as we knew it from the 20th century. Why does all this matter for those of you who are journalists and who are looking towards the future? Well, newspapers in particular matter because in most countries, the majority of investment in independent professional journalism comes from newspaper companies. This is data from the United Kingdom. So even in a case like the UK, where there's a very strong independent license fee funded public service broadcaster like the UK, newspaper companies in 2012 still accounted for more than 2/3 of investment in original reporting. And just 21% from license fee funded broadcasters, with 10% from commercially funded broadcasters, and a rounding error from digital born organizations. So the reason we should think about newspaper companies in their future is not because we should sort of care about the media habits of old people. That's fine, but that's not in itself a sort of existential importance for the future of the industry. And again, I'm not particularly invested in the shareholders or in sometimes the sort of the venture capitalists and others that speculate in newspaper companies currently. The reason we should care about it is that these companies have delivered the majority of the investment in professional journalism. And of course, particularly in countries where one cannot reasonably hope public service media to have the same degree of independence as the BBC has in the UK, this is even more important. We heard the reasoning around Mediapark's decision not to take any kind of political support. In the case of France, even in a country like France with high levels of media freedom, there are many editors and publishers who are understandably concerned about what strings might come with government support. So newspapers matter because they are still at the heart of the independent business of news provision. So why might newspapers that already find themselves in quite a tough place after a long-term structural decline, as all of us increasingly look at smartphones and various other digital devices rather than print the newspapers, why might they find themselves in an even tougher place in the future? Well, I think we need to start with this, right? We are really sort of 20 years into what I call an unfinished media revolution, where I would say the global takeaway here is that everyone everywhere with access seem to generally prefer digital, mobile, and some platform media to print and broadcast. And I would not advise anyone to bet against that development, because you risk betting against not just technology, that's one thing, you risk betting against the public, who are voting with their attention, and they're voting in favor of digital, mobile, and platform media. Why is this an unfinished revolution? Well, of course, in part because the technology continues to develop at pace, as many speakers have highlighted at this event, including the examples of innovation in the space around AI and voice, but also in the case of Mediapart, that proudly calls itself a digital newspaper, but is also constantly committed to innovation in formats and genres and use of new technologies as they develop at pace. So part of it is about development in technology, which will continue. As we know, there's a lot of money at stake, a lot of engineers hard at work to continue to develop these tools and technologies. But also for a much more fundamental reason, which is that even if the technological development for some mysterious reason stopped tomorrow, we would still see large-scale change in the media environment for the simple reason of generational replacement. Every time someone dies today in most countries around the world, that person is someone who spent their whole life reading printed newspapers, watching linear scheduled broadcasting, listening to linear scheduled radio. Every time someone comes of age, it's someone who's grown up with personal, portable, always-on digital devices. And their habits are fundamentally different. So even without further technological development, we are in for a half century of continued change, just through generational replacement. And this has really profound consequence of the business of news as this tide, this slow rolling tide, rolls across the industry. Because Even today, in 2019, the World Association of News Media, this is what used to be called newspapers, estimates that about 90% of newspaper revenues globally still come from the print product. And broadcasters, commercial broadcasters, are heavily, heavily reliant on their offline revenues too. Even after more than 20 years, many newspapers' digital operations are not profitable on their own. They're still being subsidized by profits from their print product. Around the world, many commercial broadcasters are not even really trying to make profit from digital news. They're so heavily reliant on their broadcast revenues, and they're often operating the news part of their digital offerings essentially as a loss leader, as a sort of brand awareness play, not really as a commercial operation. And it's very simple. This cannot go on indefinitely. The print subsidies and the broadcast subsidies will fade away as audiences that are invested in those media fade away. And we will have to find ways in which we, on a primarily digital basis, can build a sustainable business to support independent professional journalism. So why are we in this tough place, and why is it going to get even tougher? I think we can identify some of the main reasons, and I think we need to keep those in mind as we think about what those models might look like that could sustain us in the future. If I had to pick just one, there are never only one reason, but if I had to pick just one reason why we're in such a tough space, it's this. Is the competition for attention has massively intensified. This is a piece of what I like to call heroic social science, where sort of scientists try to do something that is sort of impossible to actually get right, but it's worth trying, because even if you don't get it quite right, it's really, really instructive what you find. So this is an attempt by a team of researchers from the United States to quantify the relationship between media supply and media demand. So how many minutes of media content does the average American, in the average American household, have access to for every minute that the average American in the average American household spend with media? And how does this change over time? So what the researchers found is development from a situation in the 1960s where the average American was making essentially what we might think of as a human scale choice. That for every minute of attention, there was something like 100 minutes of different kinds of content available. Newspapers, magazines, books, some radio, a bit of TV. And it grows slowly through the 60s and 70s, and in the 80s we have the emergence of multi-channel television. People get more and more channels to choose from, so there is some growth. We reach sort of 200 minutes of attention for every minute. And then you have the explosion in the 90s with satellite and cable TV really taking off. These are the years of sort of, Bruce Springsteen singing about 300 channels and nothing on, right? To a situation in which, in 2005, the average American, in the average American household, according to these researchers, have almost 900 minutes of media content competing for every minute of attention. The truly extraordinary thing about this graph is that, to simplify matters, the researchers considered all of the internet one option, so 1 minute, right? So in reality, for those with internet access, this graph goes towards infinity. There are more than 2 billion websites estimated in the world. Most of us are connected with a large number of people via social media and the like. So the competition for attention today is unbelievably intense compared to what it was just 20 years ago. This is an absolutely fundamental change in the business of news. What does this mean for news publishers? Well, we had a media environment that was characterized by low choice for me as a media user, and consequently high market power for media publishers over their advertisers, but also over their users. And today we live in a different world, a fundamentally different world, where I, as a media user, have high choice, and as a consequence, media publishers have low market power over advertisers and over me as a consumer. This is a very fundamental change that's happened in about 20 years. Absolutely central. And if you believe this is a competitive market, let me just tell you, it is a very competitive market. Basic economic theory would suggest that in the absence of very effective product differentiation, where things are truly distinct and not comparable, in a competitive market, the price will approximate the marginal cost of serving one additional customer. If it costs me £1 to serve Edson, as long as I can make more than £1, I have an economic incentive to do it. Now, of course, the challenge online is that the marginal cost of serving an additional customer is near zero, indistinguishable from zero. So pay models will be hard, not just because everyone who is trying to convince people to pay for news is up against a near infinite amount of other offers that compete for people's attention, but also because from now on, and forever basically, lots and lots of publishers will have every incentive to offer news free at the point of consumption, supported by advertising, almost no matter how low the advertising revenues get, because the cost of serving one more reader is close to zero. And in fact, we find in Europe at least, and in the United States, even as newspapers have moved towards pay models for digital news, by now, across 7 countries, we found about 2/3 of newspapers operating some kind of pay model. We have seen in the United States and Europe almost no commercial broadcasters try to charge for digital news. Very, very few digital-born news media, Mediapart being a very important exception, trying to charge for digital news. And of course, public service media available free at the point of consumption. So in our sample of more than 200 news sites in Europe and the United States, the majority are still free. There will be free offers from now on and for a long time to come. And things, in a way, are getting more complicated still, in the sense that the economics of publishing were always premised, of course, in part on the economies of scale. Once you had a newspaper, you benefited a lot from your size and all the ways in which you can serve more and more users through efficiency, the economies of scale, but also from what's called bundling and high barriers to entry. Bundling is this basic phenomena that you buy a print newspaper, even if you only read 10 articles, you get all 200 and you get all the ads as well, and there's no way to buy just one article. Mediapart explained very clearly why you were trying to retain a sense of exclusivity and bundle in an online space as well. And high barriers to entry is that it was very hard to launch a new newspaper because it was very expensive, and the incumbents were very good at what they were doing, and they dominated the market. Today, we live in a different market. The economies of scale are still there. There are still benefits to being big if you can run your organization efficiently and have a clear sense of purpose. But news has been unbundled. We arrive at it sideways. We read a single article, then we move on. Some of us will subscribe to a bundle, but most of us will not. So news has been unbundled, and the barriers to entry, of course, have gone down. Vox Media, for example, it would have been very hard to launch something like Vox Media. It has been very hard to launch something like Vox Media. We should have a lot of respect for that. Or Mediapart. In the 90s or in the 80s, to launch something new like that would have required a very large upfront capital investment. This stuff is still difficult, but it's less difficult than it used to be to get started. Succeeding is something else. But to get into the game is easier and cheaper than it used to be. And of course, publishers now compete head-to-head with the platform companies for attention and for advertising. And this platform economy is a winner-takes-most market that's characterized not just by the economies of scale that publishers also recognize, but also various forms of network effects. Facebook get more valuable for me every time one of my friends join it, WhatsApp, and so on and so forth. And data network effects. So data collected around one service can make another service more valuable. So there are incredible winner-takes-most dynamics at play in the platform economy. In most markets around the world, the winners of those have been the colloquially termed GAFAs from the United States, though of course in some countries it's different. In mainland China, it's Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. In both Japan and South Korea and a few markets around the world, there are very strong domestic platform companies that demonstrate that the economies of the platform environment are not distinct to large American companies. There are many others that are also leveraging the same things. And importantly, judging from how people spend their time and their money, we have to recognize audiences and advertisers mostly seem to like this. This is incredibly challenging for the business of news, and by extension for the profession of journalism. I couldn't help but notice that some previous speakers today talked a lot about control. Right? We are used to being in control. Let me tell you, we are not in control anymore. We really aren't. And we don't like that. But it seems that most of the audience and many advertisers, in fact, prefer it to what we had before. And I have to say this too. I don't know anyone under 40 who would rather have the media environment that I grew up with in the 90s than the one we have today. Not that what we have today is perfect, far from it. Many, many reasons to be concerned. Some of those reasons are new, others are old ones. But I think we really need to be realistic about what the preferences are of the public, and I think we see it every day, and I think we probably see it every day in our own habits too. We too in this room, I think, prefer smartphones, digital media, on-demand, and platform companies when we spend our time and when we spend our money to printed newspapers and linear scheduled broadcasters. So, where do we go from here? I think there are some things we need to dispense with first before we can start thinking about reality-based ways ahead. The first we need to dispense with is this. You'll miss us when we're gone. That is not a funding model. The second thing we need to dispense with is this. Society needs us. That's not a funding model either. Societies and people need lots of things. And if there is one thing we know from the long and often troubling record of human history is that people often do not get things they need. And societies often do not get things that they need. So these are not reality-based ways ahead. These are morality tales, not reality-based ways ahead. These are not funding models for journalism. So what might work if this is not a model? Well, it's clear that advertising-based models, which historically was the central model of commercial broadcasting, and it's been very important for newspapers in many places, in particular tabloid newspapers and so-called free sheets, that'll become harder, it'll become less lucrative, it'll require scale, it'll require very lean organizations with low costs. But something being difficult is not the same as something being impossible. And even if we should expect the percentage of advertising that goes into news publishers to shrink over time, a small percentage of a very large number is still a lot of money. And we will still see in the future, too, digital-born, advertising-based news organizations, primarily based on advertising. Some of them will do impressive and important journalism, and some of them will find a business model in this space. It'll be tougher, but it is possible, and we see examples of this. Reader revenue-based models, and we've seen different versions of this presented today, from a membership model to a subscription model, and both from legacy organizations and digital-born organizations. This will require really effective differentiation and a high-quality product, and that will work for some. Some things are truly worth paying for, even in an environment of near infinite competition. And I think we really need to take a moment just to appreciate how amazing that is, and how truly extraordinary an achievement it is when organizations like Mediapart or The Guardian or other organizations that are pursuing this strategy are convincing hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of people with near infinite choice that's free at the point of consumption to pay for what they do. That is an extraordinary achievement, and one I think we really need to recognize how hard that is. So, model number 2, this will work for some, but it has to be worth paying for. Simply hammering up a so-called paywall around what you already gave away for free for 20 years, that's not it. Then, of course, what I'm describing is something that economists could term a market failure, a situation in which there is something that we as a society collectively benefit from, that there is a public interest in the provision of independent professional journalism that can inform the public, hold power to account, and help facilitate a public debate, that isn't being provided in a sufficient scale and scope or distribution on a purely market basis, that could make the case for some form of intervention, whether non-profit or through public support through public policy, as we know it from public service media, and in some countries from subsidy schemes of various sorts. And if targeted, this can be highly effective. These schemes make a demonstrable difference. In the Scandinavian countries, with general direct and indirect subsidies for independent press publishers that do not allow politicians or civil servants to meddle with editorial, or in the case of genuinely independent public service broadcasting and now public service media. These things can make a difference if they are well created, and they will work for some, though I should hasten to add, of course, and in some places. I think there are many countries around the world where we have no reason to believe that politicians, or for that matter, all publishers, are committed enough to editorial independence that we would want them to be funded by everybody. So I think this is something we need to be realistic about. What are the countries in which this is even desirable, even though it is one possible model going ahead. And then, of course, finally, I think we need to remember that in addition to the commercial motives that I'm premised on here, the idea of people investing in journalism essentially for profit, because they want to do journalism to make money off of it, not only to make money off it, but also to make money off of it, or for sort of public policy reasons that they invest money in it because they believe it's right for society and we've taken a collectively binding decision to do it. there are other possible motivations for investing in journalism that we just need to recognize that are not commercial and that are not about public policy or indeed the public interest, and it's power. Right. So we need to remember that in most countries, the origins of journalism was in large part as a part of politics. Sometimes for causes that we may think of as progressive and may have sympathy for, but also, of course, often as organs of the establishment, as organs of repressive states, as organs of special interests in society, whether business or others, and that these motivations persist. That in many countries around the world, the majority of news media are owned by politicians or politically affiliated individuals and groups, or by powerful companies or rich individuals whose main motivations for owning those organizations arguably are not to make money off of them, and they certainly aren't the public interest. It is to pursue or protect their interests and their ideologies. And we just need to remember, as the barriers to entry come down and news become, relatively speaking, cheaper to produce, we will see more and more of these types of entities, these instruments, emerging in the market too. And this, I think, is one of the reasons it's so critically important to get it right. Because if we don't get it, and if we don't find ways in which journalism can sustain itself as a profession, independent and professional, we will see more and more of these other things, these instruments of influence, masquerading as independent professional journalism, but serving entirely different ideals from those who motivate most journalists. So, this is what I promised you. I hope this is what I've given you. I want to say this is not doom and gloom. I know it's tough, but I think this is a reality-based view, and I think we need to face it. If this is reality, we need to face it. This is what people in high stress and high risk and high stake situation call situational awareness. If you don't know what the situation you're in is like and where it might head, you will make catastrophic errors of judgment that make the situation even worse than it might be. It's tough. It'll go tougher for the business of news. But I think the best journalism today we see today is some of the best that we've ever seen. It's never been more important. And there are ways ahead. This can be done. We see individual organizations that are forging a way ahead. And I think last year, for the first time that I know of at least, we've seen a whole country in which there is a first sort of green shoot to suggest that maybe structurally we've arrived at a new equilibrium. So I will show you just one more graph, which is a graph from Norway, another high-income democracy that's highly wired, where we've had sort of a classic story of sort of 10 years of nonstop decline in the total revenues of the Norwegian newspaper industry, and then a stabilization. 2016, 2017, rough stabilization. And in 2018, for the first time, for years and years and years, the total net revenues of the Norwegian newspaper industry grew. Because growth in digital subscriptions and digital advertising was higher and faster than decline in print. This can be done. So let's do it. Thank you very much.